everyone, and welcome to History Week 22. Believe it or not, we are in the fourth and final quarter of this academic year. The book makes a point to call this the Age of Resolve, just so they could keep their titling consistent. Really, neither here nor there. The final quarter is going to cover roughly the years 1632 to 1707, about 75 years of world history. It's going to... We're already into the colonization of the New World and the new dynamics that's creating. But we're going to start this week by talking about a group of people that we haven't really looked at separately in several centuries, talking about the Jewish people. Their history is very unique. There is no other ethnicity, religion, civilization, however you want to term them, none other quite like the Jews. Their ability to survive and even thrive under the roughest of circumstances is just amazed historians over the centuries. They are nothing if not resilient. We're going to look at how the Jewish people fared during the Renaissance and the Reformation. So we're actually going to be backing up a century plus here to kind of look at the Jewish experience in Europe during this time period. Again, we know about the history of the Jewish people. We've all, read the Bible. We know about them being God's chosen people. You'll recall that when we started at the beginning of last year, one of the first lessons we looked at was the Roman armies destroying the Temple of Jerusalem in 7 A.D. Thousands of Jews, you'll recall, fled to the mountain fortress of Masada and eventually committed suicide rather than being captured and made prisoners by Roman soldiers. There was the Bar Kokhba revolt about 200 years after the birth of Christ, where the Jewish people, for a very brief amount of time, reestablished their homeland in the Holy Land, but they, again, were counterattacked by Rome. They were scattered basically throughout the continent of Europe. Very few of those survived after the Bar Kokhba revolt and the Roman reaction to it. During the Middle Ages, of course, we know that the Holy Land was occupied mostly by the Ottoman Turks, the Muslim Turks specifically. And, of course, this led to the Crusades, which had some victories, but mostly was a failure in terms of being able to oust the Muslims from the Holy Land. Muslims kept control of Israel for a long time, and the Jews for centuries, hundreds and hundreds of years, remained scattered. They had no home base. It's very hard to keep a culture alive when you're that scattered throughout a large geographic area. But the Jewish people did. How did the Jews, how were they treated? It depended upon where they were. In some places, they were accepted and managed to thrive. Other places, they were persecuted, and in some cases, just not welcome whatsoever. This image is in your book, and it is a superb graphic demonstration of the very different Jewish experiences all throughout Europe, and of course, eventually the New World, even South America. And when you go around reading some of these, the experiences were very different. On the downside, in Italy in 1516, about the time the Renaissance was really kicking off, the government created the idea of the Ghetto Nuovo, the new garden, I guess, is the straight translation. It was a place for Jews to live separate from Christians. And as we know from our experiences here in the U.S. over the past several generations, separate is not equal. It's not even close to equal. It cannot be equal. And these ghettos, as they soon came to be called, were a destitute place places where the people were restricted. You could not be out of the ghetto after a certain hour. They were not prisons, but they were something very close to it. In Germany in 1519, just a couple years later, 800 Jews were forced to leave. Jewish gravestones were demolished. In 1523, a community in India, Jewish community was demolished, and they fled again as refugees. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible simply did not allow Jews to live in his kingdom. In 1563, he drowned 300 Jews who refused to convert and be baptized. Even the Catholic Church in 1555, the Pope at the time, Pope Paul IV, created a ghetto system in Rome. Jews were locked into the ghettos at night. They had to wear special garments. And if that sounds familiar, you're familiar with the Yellow Star of David that they were forced to wear in the ghettos of Nazi Germany rule. Even in Mexico, in the New World, 1569, the King of Spain, Philip II, ordered Mexico to burn 200 Jews at the stake. In Lima, Peru, even, South America, 10 people found guilty of practicing Judaism. 4 were punished. 1 was burned alive. Louis XIII of France kicked all Jews out of France. But there were quite a few spots in Europe where Jews were welcomed and very much prospered. You kind of moving around this image again. The Netherlands, the Holy Roman Emperor allowed Jews freedom to live and work. Again, the Netherlands was, half Catholic, half Protestant, North versus South. But Jewish people did very well in the Dutch kingdom. In Poland, the ruler allowed Jews to settle in one city and later offered them their own charter of freedom. And 1 million Jews were living in Rome, in Poland, by the middle of the 17th century. Jewish people did very well in Poland. Even in the Ottoman Empire, under Muslim rule, Suleiman the Magnificent was very generous in his treatment of Jews, offering them positions in his government. In Denmark, King Christian IV gave Jews the freedom to worship, and they did quite well in Denmark. And in the North American colonies, Jewish settlers were welcomed. Eventually, by the early 1700s, it's estimated more than 10,000 Jews made North America their home. So the experience of the Jewish people in Europe, in the modern world, during the Renaissance and Reformation was highly dependent upon where you were. Some places welcomed them, other places bit their tongue and made them live with restrictions. Some places didn't let them in at all. England, you'll recall, but right before Henry VIII, expelled all the Jews. They did not want Jewish people in England. They eventually opened the country back up about 100 years later, but damage had been done. The Jewish culture never flourished in the UK. One of the things that kept the Jewish people together, even across great distances, was the curious development of the Yiddish language. It was a mixture of German, Hebrew, and a lot of the Slavic languages, and it became sort of the unofficial official language of Judaism, which is odd for language to develop disparate parts across a continent and not contiguously. It's really odd, but the Yiddish language really kept Jewish people together. So as we'll go back to the Jewish people, obviously, but again, they're still without a home base, but they have a few hotspots in Europe where they are thriving and their culture and their religion are thriving. Our next lesson is going to take a look at an artist who really defies categorization. We talk about such and such was a Renaissance artist. This person was a classical Baroque. Rembrandt sort of took elements of everything. He's impossible to categorize, but he had a style on all his own. Like most artists, he wasn't appreciated much during life. He had some success. He was able to make a living painting, so that had that going for him. But in terms of great accolades, those unfortunately came after he was dead. Rembrandt showed obviously a talent for painting at a very early age. And again, it was great for him that at this point of history, he could make a living producing art without being employed by a king or a ruler of some kind. He was able to be a free agent, take his own commissions, and at least make a living. He was in stark contrast to what was emerging, being called the Baroque type art. Baroque was originally described, was meant in a very negative way to describe the painters who came after the great masters of the Renaissance. They were trying to improve on Michelangelo and people like that, and hard to improve upon that. So they broke away from the classical style and just used heavily ornamented themes. It went to architecture too. If it was loud, flamboyant, it was Baroque. Rembrandt, though, was purposefully not Baroque. He was living in the Netherlands, which, again, as we said, had kind of equal Protestant and Catholic influences. His great interest was in creating realistic portraits and drawings, which look like a photograph almost today. The realism is striking, but there's artistic license used to where these portraits really come to life. He tried to draw the emotion of his subjects, and because of that, his favorite subject was himself. Rembrandt appeared in more than half of his paintings. As a result, since he painted himself so often, we have a pretty good pictographical history of his life, how he was as a young man, middle age, old, and very old. One of his more famous paintings was actually a commission. He was employed by groups and guilds that wanted portraits of their profession to highlight the profession, to promote it. In the painting, The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, he shows the scene of a doctor dissecting a corpse. That was a real-life event. The corpse in the picture is a 28-year-old prisoner who had been executed. Dr. Tulp was the anatomist who invited Rembrandt to paint the classroom scene of the dissection. The government allowed one criminal a year to be dissected in order to learn more about the human body. Even in a progressive nation like the Netherlands, they still had sort of old-fashioned views on the human body, and really it was not until the 19th century that the study of the human anatomy through dissection of corpses was really an acceptable thing, being people really had superstitions about the body. Rembrandt painted scenes from the Bible. He did so with great passion. In the presentation of the temple, he conquered the problems of air, space, and depth. He makes the family of Jesus look very small in this nativity scene here. In Amsterdam, he met a woman named Saskia and fell madly in love with her, and she quickly became his favorite painting subject. In 1634, he painted like 5 or 6 different masterpieces just of his wife in different poses. Unfortunately, their children did not live long. 3 of their babies died within weeks of their birth, so this was a family that was accustomed to pain as well. His moved to a different part of town once as a middle-aged man in Amsterdam, and found himself living next to a lot of Jews who had fled from other portions of Europe. And he grew fond of the Jewish people and began using Jewish people as subjects of some of his paintings. Not long after this, though, his wife Saskia died, and he shortly after the birth of his youngest son Titus. In the painting Widower, Rembrandt captures the emotion of a father trying to feed a baby on his own, and you can see the desperation in the picture. It's really sobering. He did remarry. Another young lady named Hendriki moved in as an assistant to his housekeeper. He fell in love with her at an older age, married. Unfortunately, she passed away at a young age. After that, only a handful of paintings from Rembrandt. When he died in 1669, he was all but forgotten by the Dutch. It wasn't really until maybe the 18th century that Rembrandt's paintings forced people to recognize his genius, and he is called one of the Dutch masters, Rembrandt. The very name is synonymous with art. All right, our final lesson goes back to the New World. Last week we talked about the Puritans who followed the Pilgrims in Massachusetts. 1620 was the Pilgrims. The Puritans showed up with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Right about the time that was happening, back in England, another Anglican priest was growing very, very disenchanted with the church. His name was Thomas Hooker. He fled to the Netherlands, much like the Puritans did, but he never felt at home, he said, in the Netherlands. He started hearing stories about this group of Puritans who had gone to the New World and had established their church there. And he said, I want to be a part of that church. So Hooker found passage to the New World and was immediately accepted as a member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Again, he was a pastor, and they were all about the church then, and so they had another pastor to help spread the gospel in the New World. He got along very well with John Winthrop. Remember, he was elected and re-elected 11 times as the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop, though, did have one part of the government that he had helped set up there that Hooker objected to. Under Winthrop, only members of the Puritan Church were allowed to vote for government leaders, community leaders. People who were not members of the church were not allowed to vote. Winthrop believed that the government should be in the hands of the godly men of the church. He thought government would work best if it were led by church people. And of course, it wasn't really an issue because 99.9% of the people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony were members of the church. Only a handful of them didn't bother joining the church. Again, they came there for religious freedom. So it wasn't really an issue. But if you stop and think about it, and Hooker obviously did, how many examples from history where we've seen the crown and the cross merged and bad things happen? They always happen. Somebody is going to be persecuted. Someone's going to be overlooked. Someone is going to be marginalized. And even though it wasn't happening at this point in the colony, again, they were all members of the church, Hooker envisioned where a government based upon church membership was going to be a problem. And he brought that up with Winthrop. Winthrop politely disagreed. He was really big on the church guiding the state. And so they had an amicable separation. Basically, Hooker said, okay, I disagree with you. I would like permission to go somewhere else and start over. And Winthrop said, okay. The Indians of the region led them to a land south of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, leading up to the Atlantic Ocean. The Indian name for this land was Quinettucut, meaning Long River. Hooker 100 settlers from 3 different congregations and headed south, guided by the natives, and they eventually founded the cities of Hartford, Wethersfield, and Windsor in the recently named Connecticut, taken by the Indian name. The colony was officially chartered by the king, even though they didn't feel much allegiance to the king, but still nice to have the charter in hand. In time, though, he went a step further to settle this colony. In 1639, Hooker and others wrote down their ideas for freedom in a document called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. The orders spelled out, in no uncertain term, the rights of men to vote and other important matters. The biggest difference, of course, you did not have to be a member of the church to vote. You just had to be a resident. Now, of course, this applied only to men, only to adults, and certainly only to whites. Again, most of them were, of one accord there, so it wasn't an issue. But again, for its time, the fact that he purposefully cut out the church from consideration in government affairs, very, very important. It's called the first constitution in world history. Maybe. It's the first to say constitution, I think. But if the ideas and ideals of the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut sound familiar, that means you've read the U.S. Constitution. We're starting to see the groundwork that government in this new world, if it's going to be done by these people, is going to be representative democracy. There is not going to be a monarchy here. There's not going to be anything like that. The ideals, of course, were certainly caught on, and eventually, even Winthrop's people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony realized that if we're going to truly have freedom of religion, we cannot tie religion in with government. And so they lifted their requirement of being a church member in order to participate and vote in the government. One bad note from the formation of the Connecticut colony was the Native American tribe there called the Pequot Indians. They did not welcome the settlers. For whatever reason, they were very hostile to the settlers from the get-go. In their hostility, the Pequots one day murdered 9 colonists. The colonists formed a militia, went back and attacked the Pequot village, burned the village, and killed all 400 of the occupants, basically ending the Pequot Indians. So, as much as we have some good news to talk about, history has some bad news too. Some things to kind of sober us as to what's going on. Anyway, we'll talk more about it Monday, and I'll see you then.